So if you haven't already checked out part one, go ahead and check that out. Link will be in the description. So in part one, Shyam talks about whether GPS matter or not, whether he got a master's degree, and whether it is useful or not. And he also even talks about Amazon work life. So it's a really interesting part. Go check it out.
Yeah, right. I get you. Yeah. Okay, now coming to probably the important part of this whole interview, the landing a job at Fang. So, what steps do you think are actually required to get into a Fang company?
There's two aspects to this, right? The first being no set of steps is going to work for everyone, right?
Okay.
That is just a disclaimer I have to put out there, right? Each person has, their own way of doing things.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think in general, it is the simple things, right? It is the things that you would think would help, right? So for example, having a good GPA is not a
Mm-hmm.
bad thing. It definitely helps, right? Having relevant experience to whatever domain you're applying for, whether that's like, machine learning or natural language processing or big data, any of that sort of stuff, having relevant experience, whether that's from internships or side projects,
Mm-hmm.
open source contributions, anything like that will always help,
Mm-hmm.
right? And outside of that, there isn't much. Like it just depends on a lot of things, right? I think the third thing that is probably the most important of all of these is being able to interview well. And
Right.
being able to interview well means you should know your data structures and algorithms. You should have a solid grasp on all your fundamentals. You should probably grind some sort of interview questions, right? Like the things you mentioned
Yeah.
earlier, or in my case, it was leak code.
Yeah. Okay.
But there's no surprises. Like I don't think you're going to find that it's some new thing that gets you into Fang, right? Or in any tech company for that matter. It's sort of the common wisdom, right, of
Mm-hmm.
how it works.
So basically, it's all about one really important thing is to get interviews and crack them with, of course, a good amount of knowledge in data structures and algorithms. And remaining is really up to the individual, right?
Yeah.
Right. And okay, here's somewhat of a silly question. A lot of beginners ask this: what programming language do I really get started with? That is the question.
Um, well, I think at least in the industry, right, the programming language is not something that is something people think about, right? At the end of the day, if you know how to write code, you can just look up the documentation for any language and write your code in that language, right?
Yeah.
But if you're starting out, if you're just learning, um, it depends on what kind of language you want to learn as well, right? If you just want to be able to write code that does cool things without having to think much, then it's Python, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of it, it would be C. Um, Java is probably the best option if you want to build something that is reliable, right? If you want to build something that you want it to be very robust, I think Java is good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just because of things like type safety and so
Mm-hmm.
on, which Python doesn't really have. It doesn't have type declarations, things like that,
Yeah.
which can be issues. But yeah, I would say between those three, right? Of course, there is a world of languages out there for people who are interested in front end development as well, but I
Mm-hmm.
am not particularly, so I cannot comment on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say as a general answer, I would say Python probably.
Okay. And what are maybe some of your cool projects that some projects that you think that you made are, pretty interesting, pretty cool, uh, be it before Amazon or during Amazon or anytime at all?
I think the coolest thing I ever made.
Yeah.
So there's this armband called the Mayo,
Mm-hmm.
and it is you just sort of put it on your hand,
Yeah.
and it can
Yeah.
detect the kind of gestures you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so this was back in 2014, which was my first year, right? And I'd not done anything until that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then for like the pretty much, I guess, the first hackathon we went to, for one of our classes, we had this little, I guess, an RC car type thing, but it's not quite an RC car. It's just a car with with a Raspberry Pi on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you can just make it do whatever you want. And so what we made was essentially you can drive this car by just doing hand
Just
things.
a
So if you do
control.
this, it's going to turn
Yeah.
left. If you do this, it's going to turn right. You do
Yes.
this, it stops. I don't know if you can see my hand, but like
Yeah, I
left,
can see it.
right,
Yeah.
stop,
Yeah.
and then accelerate, things like that. I think that was the coolest thing, right? Not in a like a pure sense, not because it was the most complex or it was the
Mhm.
most like technically demanding, but I think the sort of the outcome was so cool, and just to see it happen was
Yeah,
also like, I think that was a moment I remember very fondly when it actually worked.
I see. I see. Also, what extra skills did you have before joining Amazon that you think added some significant value to your resume?
That's a good question. I think my resume is not the most well, it's not like a top tier resume, right? It's not things you look at in workshops. I think it was very loosely put together, right? And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of things on there reference projects from my previous internships. But I think a good asset to have on your resume is previous experience,
Mm-hmm.
and that's probably what did it for me. Previous experience plus a good GPA. Like um, I didn't have sort of some of the crazy set of projects that many people have that they
Yeah,
worked on.
I see.
Um, but I think I had, well, I was academically pretty good, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
always helps.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had a very good grasp of all the fundamentals, right? All of the
Interesting. Yeah.
things that you would be interviewed about and so on. I think those were the things that made the difference for me. I don't think, um, yeah, those were the things I think that made my resume attractive potentially.
I see. So that is really the end of the video. What are your future plans? Do you have any plans for startups, or do you want to shift to another company or something? Do you have any plans?
That's a good question. So, with respect to startups, I
Mm-hmm.
think I don't think I like the aspect of risk that comes with being in a startup, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think you hear about the stories of success a lot, right? You hear a lot about startups that do go through their various series of fundings,
Yeah.
and the people that started them or were early employees, make a fortune, right?
Yeah.
But on the flip side, like startups are firstly, you will have to work like full stack. You will have to work cross disciplinary, right? You're gonna have to work in small teams, so you're gonna
Mm-hmm.
have very insane hours. If you're really committed to that project, if you really want that product to look good, you will have to do insane hours. That's just the nature of the job. And your compensation is, I mean, you might have good cash compensation, but the company may not ever see the light of day. So for
Yeah.
those reasons, I'm personally not a fan of startups.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Um, on the topic of switching companies, though, I think I'm pretty happy at Amazon right now.
Mm-hmm.
But in the future, I would like to move to a company that is more cash heavy and less stock heavy. So in general, FANG companies, their compensation is very stock heavy, right? So you will
I
get a
see.
lot of stock, and most of your stock is going to vest like in 2, 3, 4 years from now,
Mm.
right? Which means if you were in a company like, for example, Snapchat, right, as an
Mm.
example of a non-FANG company that does pay a lot of cash,
Mm.
right? That would be, they do pay more, like
Yeah.
significantly more, but of
Yeah.
course they don't pay in stock. So like maybe 10 years down the line, when Snap stock is not doing much and FANG stock is still doing great, you may have earned more in the longer term.
Right. Okay.
But yeah,
Okay.
that
Okay.
is something
Yeah.
I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's cool. That's cool. All right. Thank you, Shyam. That was a pretty good interview. I'm just gonna end the recording now.